He was born in the wrong city to the wrong family at the worst possible time. The child who would unify China and declare himself its first emperor entered the world not in the heartland of his ancestors, but in the capital of an enemy state, his father a hostage of no importance, his mother a woman of uncertain origins, his survival dependent on political calculations that could shift without warning. The year was 259 BC. The place was Handan, capital of the state of Zhao, and the infant named Ying Zheng had already become a pawn in games he was too young to understand. China, in the 3rd century BC, was not a nation, but a battlefield. The Zhou dynasty, which had once claimed authority over the civilized world, had collapsed into irrelevance centuries earlier, leaving behind a patchwork of kingdoms that scholars would call the Warring States. 7 major powers, Qin, Zhao, Han, Wei, Chu, Yan, and Qi, fought endless campaigns for territory, resources, and survival. Alliances formed and dissolved with the seasons. Cities that had stood for generations were besieged, sacked, and rebuilt under new masters. The countryside between fortified capitals became killing grounds where armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands clashed in battles that determined which states would exist and which would be erased from history. The state of Qin occupied the western frontier, separated from the central kingdoms by mountains and rivers that had once seemed to mark the edge of civilization. Other states had dismissed Qin as semi-barbarous, its people rough, its culture crude, its traditions inferior to the refined courts of the East. But Qin had been transformed a century earlier by reforms so radical that they remade not just the state, but the very concept of what a state could be. Shang Yang, a legalist philosopher who had served as Qin's chief minister, had dismantled the aristocratic order that governed other kingdoms. He replaced hereditary privilege with a system of ranks earned through military service and agricultural production. He divided the population into mutual responsibility groups where neighbors were required to report each other's crimes or share each other's punishments. He codified laws of terrifying severity: theft, desertion, failure to meet production quotas, all punishable by mutilation or death. The Qin that emerged from his reforms was a machine designed for war, its entire society oriented toward the production of grain and soldiers, its people bound by regulations that left no space for the personal loyalties and family obligations that other cultures considered sacred. Shang Yang himself was eventually torn apart by chariots on the orders of a king who had grown to fear his power. But the system he created survived his death and continued to strengthen Qin long after his bones had been scattered. By the time Yingzheng was born, Qin had become the most formidable of the warring states, its armies the most disciplined, its administration the most efficient, its reputation the most feared. But the child's father, Outrun, had no share in Qin's growing power. He was a prince of the royal house, but one of many, a grandson of the reigning king, through a lesser son, his position in the succession so remote that he had been sent to Zhao as a hostage, a diplomatic guarantee of good behavior whose life would be forfeit if Qin broke its agreements. Hostage princes lived in a peculiar limbo, too valuable to kill casually, but too expendable to treat with respect. Yiren survived in Handan on limited funds, without influence, without prospects, without any apparent future beyond growing old in comfortable captivity. Then Lu Bue arrived, and everything changed. Lu Bue was a merchant, a profession that Chinese tradition ranked below farmers, artisans, and scholars, but one that had made him extraordinarily wealthy through trade across the warring states. He possessed the calculating mind of a man who had spent his life identifying undervalued opportunities and exploiting them before others recognized their worth. When he encountered Yiren in Handan, he saw something that no one else had noticed: a prince whose very insignificance made him a potential investment. Rare goods are worth hoarding, Lu Bue reportedly told his father when explaining his plan. He would use his fortune to transform Yiren from a forgotten hostage into the heir to Qin's throne. The current crown prince had a favorite concubine who had borne him no sons. Lu Bue would bribe his way into her favor, persuade her to adopt Yiren, and thereby leapfrog the obscure prince over his more prominent brothers. In exchange, Yiren would reward his benefactor with power that no merchant could otherwise obtain. The schemes succeeded beyond reasonable expectation. Lu Bue lavished gifts on the favorite concubine, Lady Huayang, who agreed to adopt Yiren and advocate for his succession. He provided Yiren with the funds to live as a prince should live, hosting guests and building the connections that political advancement required. And he gave Yiren something else as well, a woman named Zhao Ji, whom later sources described as a dancer or concubine, who had already been Lu Bue's lover before he presented her to the prince. The question of Yingzheng's paternity would haunt his reign and his reputation. Some historians recorded that Zhao Ji was already pregnant when Lu Bue gave her to Yiren, that the child who would become first emperor was actually the merchant's son, not the prince's. Others dismissed this as slander invented by later dynasties eager to delegitimize Qin. The truth cannot be recovered after 23 centuries, but the rumor itself shaped how contemporaries and successors understood the man who unified China as a bastard, an impostor, someone whose very right to rule was tainted by the circumstances of his conception. What is certain is that Yingzheng was born in Handan in 259 BC, that his official father was the hostage prince Yiren, and that his early years were spent in constant danger. Relations between Qin and Zhao deteriorated sharply after his birth. In 260 BC, the two states fought the Battle of Changping, one of the largest and most devastating engagements in ancient history. Qin forces under General Baiqi trapped a Zhao army of perhaps 400,000 men and, after their surrender, executed them all, buried alive, according to most accounts, in a massacre that traumatized the surviving population and made Qin's name synonymous with merciless brutality. The following year, Qin armies besieged Handan itself. Inside the city, 3-year-old Yingzheng and his mother became targets rather than protected guests. Zhao authorities considered executing the hostage family in retaliation for Qin aggression. Yiren escaped through bribery, fleeing to Qin and abandoning his wife and son to whatever fate awaited them. Zhao Ji and her child survived only through concealment, hidden by her family, while the siege raged around them and the city's defenders held out against the Qin assault. The siege eventually failed. Qin forces withdrew and Handan survived, but the experience left marks that shaped the child's understanding of the world. He had been abandoned by his father, hunted by his hosts, preserved only by luck and the protection of people who had no particular reason to keep him alive. The lesson was clear before he was old enough to articulate it. Trust was dangerous, security was illusion, and survival depended on power that he did not yet possess. The family reunited years later, when shifting political circumstances made it safe for Zhao Ji and her son to travel to Qin. Lu Bue's investment was paying off. King Zhaoxiang of Qin died in 251 BC. The crown prince who had adopted Yiren became king and died almost immediately. Yiren inherited the throne as King Zhuangxiang. The forgotten hostage was now ruler of the most powerful state in China, and his son Yingzheng was heir apparent. King Zhuangxiang reigned for only 3 years, dying in 247 BC when Yingzheng was 13 years old. The boy who had spent his early childhood hiding from assassins in an enemy city was suddenly king of Qin, ruler, at least in title, of the state that had buried 400,000 prisoners alive and besieged the city of his birth. He was too young to govern. Lu Buwei, the merchant who had engineered his family's rise, became regent, holding the real power while the young king learned his role. The court that surrounded him was a maze of factions, ambitions, and hidden loyalties, each minister and advisor calculating how the boy's reign might serve their interests. His mother, the former dancer whose past remained a source of whispered scandal, wielded influence that would eventually produce catastrophic consequences. Yingzheng had inherited the throne of Qin, but he had not inherited control. The kingdom that would one day conquer all of China was ruled by regents and ministers who saw their young king as a tool to be managed rather than a sovereign to be obeyed. The legalist principles that governed Qin emphasized that laws and systems mattered more than individuals. But the boy on the throne was already learning that individuals who controlled the systems could use them for purposes the laws never intended. He watched, listened, and waited. The patience that circumstances forced upon him would become one of his most formidable qualities. He could not yet strike at those who held power over him, but he could observe how they exercised that power, could identify their weaknesses and their dependencies, could prepare for the moment when waiting would give way to action. That moment was still years away. For now, the boy king sat on a throne that others controlled, learning the arts of rule in a court where trust meant vulnerability and mercy meant weakness. The making of an emperor had begun. Lu Buwei ruled Qin in everything but name. The merchant who had purchased a kingdom now enjoyed its rewards, holding the title of chancellor and the informal designation second father that acknowledged his role in creating the dynasty. He commanded armies, directed policy, and managed the court with the same calculating efficiency that had built his trading fortune. The young king attended ceremonies, received ambassadors, and performed the rituals that legitimacy required. But everyone understood where power actually resided. The arrangement suited Lu Buwei's purposes, and for several years it functioned smoothly. The regent was intelligent enough to govern well, securing Qin's borders and continuing the administrative improvements that had made the state formidable. He gathered scholars to compile an encyclopedia of knowledge, demonstrating cultural ambitions that challenged the Eastern Kingdom's assumption that Qin was merely a land of soldiers and farmers. The boy king grew older under his supervision, receiving the education in strategy, history, and governance that a future ruler required. But the court concealed tensions that would eventually erupt into violence. Yingzheng's mother, the Queen Dowager Zhao, had not become less dangerous with her son's accession. Her relationship with Lu Buwei, whatever its precise nature before her marriage, remained a source of scandal and political vulnerability. At some point, the regent decided that the risk outweighed the pleasure. He needed to extract himself from the Queen Dowager's bed without provoking her anger or losing her support. His solution created a catastrophe far worse than the problem it was meant to solve. Lu Buwei introduced the Queen Dowager to a man named Lao Ai, who possessed physical attributes that made him valuable as a lover and a scheme that made him dangerous as a political actor. To install Lao Ai in the palace, they arranged for him to be falsely castrated. He underwent a fake procedure that left him anatomically intact, while officially classifying him as a eunuch who could legitimately serve in the women's quarters. The deception worked for years. Lao Ai became the Queen Dowager's constant companion, her lover, and eventually the father of 2 sons, whose existence had to be hidden from everyone outside the conspiracy. The Queen Dowager rewarded him with estates, servants, and influence that made him one of the most powerful men in Qin. He built a faction of supporters, distributed patronage, and began to imagine a future in which his own sons might somehow displace the king who stood between them and the throne. Yingzheng was approaching adulthood during these years, and the regency that had seemed permanent was developing an expiration date. Qin custom required that a king undergo a capping ceremony at the age of 22, formally marking his transition to full adult authority. As that date approached, those who had benefited from the king's minority faced uncomfortable questions about their futures. Lao Ai, whose position depended entirely on the Queen Dowager's favor, and whose crimes would mean death if exposed, had the most to fear. In 238 BC, as preparations for the capping ceremony proceeded, Lao Ai made his desperate move. He forged orders using the Queen Dowager's seals, mobilized the household troops and retainers he had accumulated, and attempted to seize the palace at Yong, where the ceremony was to take place. The goal was apparently to kill the king before he could assume full power, installing one of the Queen Dowager's illegitimate sons in his place, and preserving the arrangement that had made Lao Ai wealthy and influential. The rebellion failed almost immediately. Yingzheng had been watching the court's intrigues far more carefully than his enemies assumed. He had prepared for exactly this kind of challenge, cultivating loyalties among military commanders who owed nothing to the Queen Dowager's faction. When Lao Ai's forces attacked, they found themselves outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The pretender fled, but was captured within days, his conspiracy collapsing as supporters rushed to betray each other in hopes of mercy. The punishment revealed a capacity for calculated brutality that would characterize Yingzheng's entire reign. Lao Ai was executed by being torn apart by chariots, his limbs tied to horses that were driven in opposite directions until his body came apart. His entire clan was exterminated to the third degree of relationship. The 2 infant sons he had fathered with the Queen Dowager were killed, their existence too dangerous to permit regardless of their age or innocence. Supporters and associates were executed, exiled, or stripped of rank depending on their degree of involvement. The message was unmistakable. Conspiracy against this king would be punished with a thoroughness that left no roots from which future rebellion might grow. The Queen Dowager herself presented a more complicated problem. Executing his own mother would have violated the filial principles that Chinese culture considered sacred, potentially delegitimizing Yingzheng's rule in ways that military victory could not prevent. He chose exile instead, banishing her to a palace in Yong, where she would live under guard, separated from the court and from any possibility of further political mischief. When ministers protested that the punishment was too harsh, that a son should not treat his mother so severely, the king had 27 of them executed before one brave advisor convinced him that such measures were damaging his reputation. The Queen Dowager was eventually recalled to the capital, but she never regained influence. Lu Bui's fate unfolded more slowly, but no less certainly. The regent had not participated in Lao Ai's rebellion, but he had created the conditions that made it possible. He had introduced Lao Ai to the Queen Dowager, had facilitated the fraudulent castration, had allowed a conspiracy to develop in the court he supposedly controlled. Even if he had not intended the rebellion, his negligence or his hidden complicity made him responsible for the greatest threat the young king had faced. Yingzheng stripped Lu Bui of his position as chancellor, but initially allowed him to retain his estates and his life. The merchant regent retired to his lands, perhaps believing that his earlier services to the royal family would protect him from further consequences. He was wrong. In 235 BC, the king ordered Lu Bui to relocate to the remote southwest. a barely disguised exile that signaled permanent disgrace. Rather than endure the journey and the humiliation that awaited, Lu Buwei drank poison and died. The man who had hoarded rare goods and purchased a kingdom ended as one more casualty of the system he had helped create. The elimination of Lao Ai and Lu Buwei left Yingzheng in control of Qin for the first time since his father's death. He was 22 years old, had survived a coup attempt by his mother's lover, had destroyed the faction that had dominated the court throughout his minority, and had demonstrated a ruthlessness that made potential enemies reconsider their ambitions. The boy king had become a king, in fact, as well as name. New advisors rose to fill the vacuum left by the purges. Li Si, a scholar from the state of Chu, who had studied legalist philosophy, became one of the king's most trusted counselors. He would eventually serve as chancellor, implementing policies that extended Qin's administrative methods across all of China. Wei Liao, a military strategist, provided advice on the campaigns that would soon begin. These men understood that they served at the king's pleasure, and that the king's pleasure could be withdrawn at any moment for any reason. The lesson of Lu Buwei's fall was clear. Usefulness was survival, but usefulness was not safety. Yingzheng had learned his own lessons from the crisis. He had learned that courts concealed conspiracies, that regents sought their own advantage, that even mothers could nurture threats to their sons' survival. He had learned that mercy invited further challenges, while brutality discouraged them. He had learned that the legalist principles on which Qin was built, the subordination of personal relationships to systematic control, applied to kings as well as commoners. Most importantly, he had learned that Qin, as it existed, was not large enough, not secure enough, not powerful enough to guarantee his safety. As long as rival kingdoms existed, they would scheme against him. As long as other powers remained unconquered, they would shelter his enemies and threaten his borders. The only permanent solution was the elimination of all alternatives, the unification of the entire Chinese world under his personal control. The conquest that would create an empire had found its purpose. The king who would become first emperor had found his mission. Qin was no longer ruled by regents. The king now governed alone, and he was hungry for more. The strategy that would conquer China began not with armies, but with gold. Li Si had advised his king that the rival states could be defeated more cheaply through bribery than through battle. Spend 300,000 gold pieces, he reportedly counseled, to buy their ministers and disrupt their plans. The entire empire can be conquered in 15 years. The approach reflected the legalist understanding that men served their interests, that loyalty could be purchased, and that a well-placed bribe often accomplished what a well-trained army could not. Qin's agents spread across the 6 remaining kingdoms, offering wealth to ministers who might slow their state's preparations, sowing discord between rulers and their generals, purchasing the betrayals that would open gates and reveal weaknesses. The gold flowed freely because Qin possessed resources that smaller states could not match. The accumulated wealth of generations of efficient taxation, the tribute extracted from territories already conquered, the reserves that a disciplined administration had built while other kingdoms squandered their revenues on palace luxuries. The military campaigns that followed exploited the chaos that corruption created. Han fell first in 230 BC, the smallest and weakest of the remaining states, its territory squeezed between Qin and its neighbors, its government paralyzed by factions that Qin gold had cultivated. The conquest required minimal effort. Han had been hollowed out before the armies arrived. Zhao came next, And here the conquest carried personal meaning that transcended strategy. This was the state that had threatened to execute Yingzheng as an infant, that had besieged his childhood home while his father fled and his mother hid. When Qin forces captured Handan in 228 BC, the king traveled to the city of his birth to supervise the vengeance he had contemplated for decades. Those who had participated in his family's persecution, or whose families had participated, were identified and buried alive. The atrocity served notice that this king possessed a long memory and an unlimited capacity for retribution. Wei fell in 225 BC through engineering rather than assault. The capital of Daliang was too strongly fortified for conventional siege, so Qin commanders diverted the Yellow River, flooding the city until its walls collapsed under the weight of water and mud. The population that survived the flooding surrendered to an enemy that had demonstrated willingness to reshape geography itself in pursuit of victory. Chu presented the greatest challenge. The southern kingdom was vast, its territories stretching across river valleys and mountain ranges that had never submitted to northern control. Its population exceeded any other state's. Its military traditions were ancient and formidable. A young general named Li Xin assured the king that 200,000 men would suffice for the conquest. He was catastrophically wrong. Chu forces counterattacked, destroying Li Xin's army in a defeat that represented Qin's most significant setback of the entire unification campaign. The king turned to Wang Jian, an older and more cautious commander who had led successful campaigns against Zhao and other states. Wang Jian demanded 600,000 men, the largest army Qin had ever assembled, a force so enormous that its mobilization strained even Qin's formidable administrative capacity. The king agreed, understanding that Chu's defeat was worth any price. Wang Jian marched south and spent a year wearing down Chu resistance through attrition rather than decisive battle, waiting until his enemy had exhausted itself before delivering the final blow. Chu fell in 223 BC, its king captured, its territories absorbed into the expanding Qin domain. Yan had attempted to prevent its own destruction through assassination. In 227 BC, as Qin armies approached, a man named Jing Kai gained audience with the king by claiming to bring the head of a Yan traitor and maps of Yan territory. The presentation was a ruse. Concealed within the rolled maps was a poisoned dagger. Jing Kai seized the weapon and lunged at the king, who stumbled backward around a pillar while his court stood frozen in shock. Guards were forbidden to enter the throne room armed, and ministers were too startled to react. The king drew his own sword, but the blade was too long to clear its scabbard easily. Jing Kai pursued him around the pillar until a physician threw his medicine bag at the assassin, creating a moment's distraction. The king finally freed his weapon and struck, wounding Jing Kai badly enough to end the attack. Guards rushed in and finished the assassin while the king stood trembling with rage and the realization of how close he had come to death. The assassination attempt accelerated Yan's destruction. Qin armies conquered the state in 222 BC, hunting down its royal family with a thoroughness that reflected the king's fury. The ruler who had sent Jing Kai was captured and executed. His line was exterminated. The kingdom that had gambled on a dagger in a throne room paid for its failure with annihilation. Qi remained, the last of the warring states, the Eastern Kingdom, whose wealth and culture had once made it the center of Chinese civilization. Qi had watched the other states fall without offering assistance, its ministers accepting Qin bribes to counsel neutrality, its king believing that accommodation might preserve what resistance could not. The strategy produced exactly the result that wiser observers had predicted. Qie stood alone, without allies, facing an empire that had absorbed all its former neighbors. The conquest was almost anticlimactic. In 221 BC, Qin armies crossed into Qi without meeting significant resistance. The king of Qi surrendered without battle, accepting exile and a pension in exchange for his life. The last independent state in China had ceased to exist. Yingzheng was 39 years old. In 17 years, almost exactly the timeline Li Si had predicted, he had conquered 6 kingdoms, unified a landmass larger than any previous Chinese dynasty had controlled, and eliminated every rival who might have challenged his supremacy. The warring states period that had defined Chinese history for 2.5 centuries had ended. Something new was beginning. The king required a new title to match his new status. Previous rulers had called themselves Wang, king, but that title was now inadequate for someone who ruled all the king's former domains. After consultation with his advisors, he combined elements from the legendary sage kings of antiquity, Huang from the Yellow Emperor, and Dai from the other divine rulers who had supposedly ordered the world at the beginning of time. The compound Huangdi, Emperor, had never been used by a living ruler. It claimed not merely political authority, but cosmic significance. He added one more element, Shi, meaning first. He would be Qin Shi Huang, first emperor of Qin. His successors would be second emperor, third emperor, continuing through generations unto the 10,000th generation. The dynasty he had founded would rule forever, or so he intended. The title announced ambitions that extended beyond his own lifetime, a claim to permanence that only the future could validate or refute. The conquest was complete. The question now was what to do with what he had won. 6 kingdoms with different traditions, different laws, different systems of measurement and writing and thought had been forced into a single empire. The aristocrats who had ruled those kingdoms retained followers and resentments. The populations that had fought against Qin remembered defeats and humiliations. The territory itself, mountains and rivers and distances that defied easy communication, resisted the centralization that Qin methods required. Qin Shi Huang had proven he could conquer. Now he would have to prove he could rule. Conquest ends. The task of building began. The debate that shaped China's next 2,000 years occurred within months of unification. Some ministers argued that the emperor should follow ancient precedent, dividing the conquered territories among his sons and loyal generals, creating feudal domains that would acknowledge Qin supremacy while governing themselves according to local traditions. The system had worked for the Zhou dynasty for centuries. It recognized that China was too vast and too diverse for direct rule from a single capital. Li Si demolished the argument with characteristic legalist logic. The Zhou system had failed. That was why the warring states had existed at all. Feudal lords inevitably pursued their own interests, building power bases that would challenge the center within a generation or two. The emperor's sons would become rivals. Their descendants would become enemies. The unity purchased with so much blood would dissolve back into chaos. The only solution was to eliminate feudalism entirely, replacing hereditary aristocrats with appointed officials who served at the emperor's pleasure and could be removed the moment they proved disloyal or incompetent. Qin Shi Huang accepted Li Si's counsel. China would be divided not into kingdoms, but into commanderies, 36 administrative units, later expanded as the empire grew, each governed by officials whom the emperor appointed and the emperor could dismiss. These administrators would implement standardized laws, collect standardized taxes, and report to the capital through standardized channels. No territory would belong to any family. No position would pass from father to son. No power would exist that the emperor had not granted and could not revoke. The decision represented a revolutionary break with everything Chinese civilization had previously assumed about proper governance. For 1,000 years, authority had flowed through bloodlines. Legitimacy had derived from ancestry, and the relationship between ruler and ruled had been mediated by aristocratic hierarchies that possessed their own claims to loyalty. Qin Shi Huang swept it all away, replacing tradition with bureaucracy, heritage with merit, and the web of personal obligations with the impersonal mechanisms of the state. The old aristocracy could not be permitted to survive as a potential nucleus for resistance. The emperor ordered 120,000 noble families, the ruling classes of the conquered kingdoms, to relocate to Xianyang, his capital. Uprooted from the lands where their ancestors had built influence over generations, surrounded by imperial forces, dependent on stipends that the state could withdraw at any moment, these former lords could be watched, controlled, and prevented from rallying the populations that had once served them. Their weapons followed them into irrelevance. The emperor commanded that all arms in the conquered territories be collected and transported to Xianyang, where they were melted down and cast into 12 enormous bronze statues. Each figure reportedly weighed over 30 tons. They stood in the palace complex as monuments to the pacification of the empire and as practical insurance against revolt. An unarmed population could not resist. A disarmed aristocracy could not rebel. The statues transformed the instruments of war into symbols of the peace that absolute power had imposed. Standardization extended into every aspect of life. The conquered states had used different systems of writing, the same words rendered in scripts so varied that documents from one kingdom might be illegible in another. Qin Shi Huang imposed a unified script throughout the empire, destroying the regional variations that had developed over centuries. Officials everywhere would write the same characters. Laws everywhere would be read in the same forms. The bureaucratic communication that held the empire together would flow without the friction of translation. Weights and measures received similar treatment. A bushel in Chu had differed from a bushel in Qi. A foot in Yan had not matched a foot in Wei. The variations had enabled local customs but obstructed imperial administration. Standardized units replaced the chaos, ensuring that taxes could be assessed consistently, that trade could proceed without constant conversion, that the state could measure what it controlled with precision that previous governments had never achieved. Even axle widths were standardized. Carts throughout the empire would be built to identical specifications, their wheels fitting the ruts that accumulated on the roads the emperor was constructing. The requirement seemed trivial, but its implications were profound. Goods and armies could move across China without the delays that mismatched vehicles would have created. The empire's transportation network would function as a single system rather than a patchwork of incompatible regional arrangements. The roads themselves represented engineering achievements that would not be surpassed for centuries. The Jidao, straight roads, radiated from Xianyang to the empire's frontiers, their surfaces compacted and maintained, their width sufficient for the rapid movement of troops. The network allowed the emperor to project force anywhere in his domains within weeks rather than months. Rebellions could be suppressed before they spread. Commands could reach distant governors before circumstances changed. The roads made the empire governable in ways that geography alone would have prevented. Canals complemented the roads, enabling the movement of bulk goods that overland transport could not efficiently handle. The Lingkou Canal constructed to supply armies operating in the far south, connected river systems that nature had kept separate, allowing boats to travel from the Yangtze watershed to the Pearl River and the territories beyond. The project required cutting through mountains and managing water levels across terrain that seemed designed to prevent exactly what the engineers accomplished. The canal remained in use for over 2,000 years, outlasting the dynasty that built it by margins that would have satisfied even the emperor's ambitions for permanence. The northern frontier demanded different solutions. The Xiongnu, nomadic peoples who raided from the steppes beyond China's agricultural lands, had threatened the warring states for generations. Qin Shi Huang dispatched General Meng Tian with 300,000 men to drive the Xiongnu back and secure the border. The campaign succeeded in pushing the nomads northward, but the emperor understood that military victory alone could not permanently solve the problem. The steppe was too vast, the nomads too mobile, the frontier too long for armies to defend every point against raiders who could strike and vanish. The walls that Qin Shi Huang ordered constructed were not the single continuous barrier that later ages would imagine. They were instead a network of fortifications, rammed earth walls connecting natural obstacles, watchtowers providing surveillance, garrison posts supplying the troops who manned the defenses. Previous states had built similar walls along their own northern borders. The emperor linked these existing structures and extended them, creating a defensive system that stretched across thousands of miles. The labor required was measured in hundreds of thousands of workers. The deaths among those workers became legendary, even in an age accustomed to brutality on an imperial scale. The emperor himself traveled constantly, conducting inspection tours that took him to every region of his domains. He visited sacred mountains, performed rituals that announced his authority to heaven and earth, erected stone inscriptions proclaiming his achievements. The journey served practical purposes. They allowed him to observe local conditions, to assess the loyalty of officials, to demonstrate his presence to populations that might otherwise forget who ruled them. But they also reflected a restlessness that seemed to intensify as his reign progressed, a need for movement that kept him away from the capital for months at a time. Xianyang itself expanded to match imperial ambitions. The emperor ordered the construction of palaces replicating those of every conquered kingdom, arranged so that he could survey his domains symbolically from his capital. The Epang Palace, had it been completed, would have been the largest structure in the ancient world, a complex so vast that later sources claimed it could hold 10,000 people. Construction continued throughout the reign, consuming resources and labor that might have been devoted to purposes less focused on imperial glorification. Order had replaced the chaos of the warring states, but the order was maintained through fear rather than consent. Legalist law made no allowances for circumstances or intentions. Punishments fell on the guilty and the unlucky with equal severity. The population had been pacified, but pacification was not loyalty. The aristocrats relocated to Xianyang remembered what they had lost. The conscripts laboring on walls and roads remembered the families they had left behind. The scholars who had served rival courts remembered traditions that the new order was systematically erasing. The emperor had unified China, standardized its administration, and built infrastructure that would endure for millennia. He had also created an empire that depended entirely on his personal will, and he was beginning to realize that even an emperor's will had limits that time would eventually enforce. The search for permanence was about to become an obsession. The crisis began at a banquet. In 213 BC, a scholar named Chunyu Yue rose to address the emperor during a celebration of imperial achievements. He argued that the dynasty would be stronger if it followed ancient precedent. enfeoffing the emperor's sons and relatives with territories of their own. The Zhou dynasty had endured for 8 centuries through such arrangements. The Qin's system of appointed officials lacked the bonds of blood loyalty that would preserve the empire across generations. The criticism struck at the foundations of everything Qin Shi Huang had built. Li Si responded with a memorial that reframed the debate in terms that demanded immediate action. The problem, he argued, was not the emperor's policies, but the scholars who criticized them. These men measured the present against an idealized past, using ancient texts to undermine contemporary authority. They gathered students, formed factions, and spread discontent through appeals to traditions that the empire had deliberately superseded. As long as such men could cite historical precedents against imperial decisions, the emperor's will would never be truly absolute. The solution Li Si proposed was comprehensive. Burn the books. Not all books, works on medicine, divination, agriculture, and Qin's own historical records would be preserved. But the poetry, philosophy, and history of the conquered states would be destroyed. Private individuals would have 30 days to surrender their copies to local officials for burning. After that deadline, anyone possessing forbidden texts would be branded and sentenced to years of labor on the frontier walls. Scholars who discussed the banned works among themselves would be executed. Those who used ancient precedents to criticize present policies would be killed along with their families. The emperor approved the memorial, and the burning began. Across the empire, texts that had preserved the wisdom of centuries were fed to flames. The Book of Songs, the Book of Documents, the historical records of the conquered kingdoms. Generations of accumulated thought transformed into ash because one advisor had convinced one ruler that intellectual diversity threatened political control. The loss was incalculable, though its full dimensions would not become clear until later dynasties attempted to reconstruct what had been destroyed. The book burnings did not silence all opposition. Some scholars hid texts, burying them in walls, or memorizing their contents so that the words might survive, even if the physical copies did not. Others continued to criticize the emperor privately, trusting that their conversations would not be reported. The alchemists and magicians who had gathered at court proved particularly troublesome. They promised the emperor immortality, accepted his gold, and then fled when their elixirs failed to deliver eternal life. 2 such charlatans, Hou Sheng and Lu Sheng, escaped after denouncing the emperor to each other in terms that informants reported back to the palace. They called him power-hungry, obstinate, and cruel, a ruler who trusted no one, who punished minor offenses with death, who had made himself so terrifying that no one dared tell him the truth. Their flight and their criticisms enraged Qin Shi Huang, who ordered an investigation into the scholars remaining at court. The investigation became a purge. Under interrogation, scholars implicated each other, each accusation generating new arrests, the circle of alleged conspirators expanding until over 460 men had been condemned. The emperor ordered them buried alive in the capital, a mass execution that served as warning to anyone who might consider similar disloyalty. The precise charges against these men varied, but the underlying offense was the same. They had threatened, or might someday threaten, the emperor's control. Crown Prince Fusu objected. The eldest son and heir apparent, Fusu had developed a reputation for Confucian sympathies and humane governance that distinguished him from his father's legalist severity. He argued that killing so many scholars would destabilize the empire, that the men being executed included followers of Confucius, whose teachings promoted social harmony rather than rebellion. The criticism was measured, the advice reasonable, and utterly unacceptable to an emperor who had learned to interpret disagreement as disloyalty. Qin Shi Huang exiled his own son. Fusu was sent to the northern frontier to serve under General Meng Tian, ostensibly to gain military experience but actually to remove him from the court, where his moderate views might attract followers. The heir apparent found himself supervising wall construction thousands of miles from the capital, his access to his father severed, his influence eliminated, his future dependent entirely on surviving, until the emperor's death allowed him to implement the gentler policies he favored. The emperor's isolation deepened as the purges eliminated those who might have offered honest counsel. He trusted no one completely, not his ministers, not his sons, not the guards who protected him. He moved between palaces unpredictably, never sleeping in the same location twice, never announcing his itinerary in advance. Anyone who revealed his whereabouts faced execution. The man who ruled all of China had become a prisoner of his own suspicion, surrounded by servants too terrified to speak and advisors too calculating to tell him anything he did not wish to hear. The search for immortality intensified as mortality pressed closer. Qin Shi Huang dispatched expeditions to find the legendary islands where immortals supposedly dwelt, where elixirs of eternal life could be obtained by those bold enough to seek them. The most famous expedition, led by a man named Xu Fu, sailed east with 3,000 young men and women, supposedly to present gifts to the immortals who would share their secrets in return. Xu Fu never returned. Later legends claimed he reached Japan and founded settlements there, rather than face the emperor's wrath with empty hands. Other seekers of immortality proved more directly dangerous. A musician named Gao Jianli had once been a friend of Jing Ke, the assassin who had nearly killed the emperor years earlier. Gao Jianli was renowned for his skill with a stringed instrument, and despite his connections, the emperor summoned him to perform at court, but ordered his eyes put out first, eliminating any possibility of a visual attack. Gao Jianli played for the emperor repeatedly, memorizing distances and sounds until he knew exactly where his target sat. He filled his instrument with lead and swung it at the emperor's head. He missed. He was executed immediately, and the emperor never again allowed former associates of his enemies to approach him. Zhang Liang, whose family had served the conquered state of Han for generations, organized an even more elaborate attempt. He hired a strongman and constructed an iron cone weighing over 100 pounds, positioning the assassin along a route where the emperor's procession would pass. The cone was hurled with enough force to destroy the carriage it struck, but it struck the wrong carriage. The emperor had begun traveling with multiple identical vehicles, switching between them unpredictably. Zhang Liang escaped and would eventually play a crucial role in the dynasty that replaced the Qin. The emperor survived, but added another layer of paranoia to defenses that already verged on the pathological. The inspection tours continued despite the dangers, driven by the same restlessness that had characterized the emperor's entire reign. He could not remain in the capital, could not trust reports from distant provinces, could not accept that his empire functioned without his personal supervision. The journeys exhausted him. He was approaching 50, old by the standards of his era, his health deteriorating under the strain of constant movement and constant fear. But stopping seemed more dangerous than continuing. An emperor who stayed in one place was an emperor who could be found, targeted, and destroyed. The mausoleum had been under construction since his accession to the throne of Qin, decades earlier. Hundreds of thousands of workers labored to create a tomb complex that would house the emperor for eternity, an underground palace equipped with everything he might need in the afterlife. guarded by armies that would never desert, protected by traps that would kill any intruder who penetrated its defenses. The preparations for death proceeded simultaneously with the search for immortality, as if the emperor himself was uncertain which outcome to expect. He had unified China, silenced its scholars, and terrorized its population into compliance. He had sought eternal life through every means that charlatans and magicians could suggest. He had built a tomb designed to preserve his power beyond death. Now, in the autumn of 210 BC, he embarked on what would prove to be his final journey. Another inspection tour of his eastern provinces. Another attempt to demonstrate that his grip on the empire remained as firm as ever. He would not return alive. The mausoleum that awaited him had been under construction for 36 years. Work had begun when he was still a boy, king in Qin, before the conquests, before the title of emperor, before the book burnings and the buried scholars and the search for immortality that had consumed his final years. At its peak, over 700,000 laborers had toiled on the project. Conscripts, convicts, and craftsmen assembled from across the empire to build a tomb complex that would preserve the emperor's power into eternity. The scale defied imagination. The burial mound alone rose over 100 meters, a man-made mountain covering the underground palace where the emperor would rest. Around it spread an outer wall, more than 6 kilometers in circumference, enclosing temples, administrative buildings, and the infrastructure necessary to maintain the site. The complex was not merely a tomb, but a city of the dead, designed to provide everything the emperor might require in the afterlife. The underground palace at the center replicated the world the emperor had ruled. According to accounts recorded a century later, the ceiling was inlaid with pearls representing the stars, creating an artificial heaven over the chamber where the body would lie. Below, craftsmen had constructed rivers and seas of liquid mercury, the poisonous metal flowing through channels that reproduced the Yangtze, the Yellow River, and the ocean beyond. Machines kept the mercury circulating perpetually, an eternal geography serving an eternal ruler. Modern soil tests have confirmed mercury levels around the mound hundreds of times higher than normal, suggesting that these accounts, however fantastical they seemed, may have described something real. Crossbows rigged to fire automatically would kill any intruder who penetrated the outer defenses. The craftsmen who knew the tomb's secrets and the layout of its traps were sealed inside when construction concluded, their knowledge dying with them in the darkness they had helped create. The concubines who had not borne children were buried with their master, their lives deemed less valuable than the continuity of service they could provide in death. The tomb was designed not only to honor the emperor, but to protect him, its defenses ensuring that he would never be disturbed, its sacrifices demonstrating that his power over life and death extended beyond his own mortality. The terracotta army stood guard in pits east of the burial mound, thousands of life-size soldiers arranged in battle formation, each figure individually crafted with distinct features, hairstyles, and expressions. Infantry, cavalry, archers, and charioteers assumed positions they would hold for millennia, their clay bodies equipped with real weapons, their painted surfaces preserving the colors of uniforms that had long since faded on their living counterparts. The army represented the forces that had conquered China, frozen at the moment of their triumph, prepared to defend their commander against whatever enemies the afterlife might present. The soldiers' individuality was perhaps the most remarkable feature of their construction. In an empire that had standardized everything, writing, measurements, laws, even the width of cart axles, the craftsmen who built the terracotta army created 8,000 unique faces. Some historians have speculated that real soldiers modelled for the figures, their likenesses preserved in clay, while their bodies aged and died and returned to the earth. Others suggest that the variations were simply artistic flourishes, demonstrations of skill that served no practical purpose beyond honouring the master the army would serve. Whatever the explanation, the figures stood as testimony to the resources the emperor could command. Wealth and labour sufficient to populate an underground kingdom with an army that would never desert. The fifth inspection tour began in late 210 BC, carrying the emperor east toward the coast, where previous expeditions had sought the islands of immortals. His health had deteriorated visibly. Ministers who accompanied him noted that he seemed weaker than on previous journeys. His energy diminished, his stamina failing. But he insisted on continuing, driven by the same restlessness that had characterized his entire reign, unable to accept the limitations that age and illness were imposing. At Shaq, a place whose name meant sand dune, the emperor died. The precise cause went unrecorded. Illness, perhaps, or the accumulated strain of decades of paranoid vigilance. He was 49 years old, had ruled Qin for 37 years, and the unified empire for 11. The man who had conquered the warring states, standardized Chinese civilization, and terrorized his subjects into submission, had finally encountered the one enemy that no army could defeat and no wall could exclude. The death created an immediate crisis. The emperor had died far from the capital, surrounded by a small travelling court that lacked the authority to manage a succession. Crown Prince Fusu remained in exile on the northern frontier, his relationship with his father unrepaired, his right to inherit uncertain. The ministers who knew of the death faced a choice: announce it immediately and risk chaos, or conceal it long enough to shape the transition according to their own interests. Zhao Gao made the choice. He was a eunuch who had risen to influence as tutor to the emperor's youngest son, Hu Hai, and who understood that Fusu's succession would end his own career. Fusu would bring advisors of his own, would implement the moderate policies that had caused his exile, would have no use for the men who had served his father's harshest impulses. Zhao Gao's survival and his ambitions required a different outcome. He approached Li Yasi with a proposal that was also a threat. Together, they could forge an imperial edict naming Hu Hai as heir, could send orders commanding Fusu to commit suicide, could manage the succession in ways that preserved their positions. If Li Si refused, Zhao Gao would ensure that he was destroyed alongside the faction he had served. The chancellor, calculating the odds, chose complicity over principle. The conspiracy proceeded with bureaucratic efficiency. A forged edict proclaimed that Fusu and General Meng Tian had committed crimes deserving death. Both were ordered to kill themselves immediately. Fusu, too loyal to question what appeared to be his father's command, obeyed. He took his own life without investigating whether the orders were genuine. Meng Tian hesitated and was arrested, eventually forced to take poison after Hu Hai's succession was secure. The men who might have challenged the conspiracy were eliminated before they knew a conspiracy existed. The imperial procession continued its journey as if nothing had changed. The emperor's body remained in his carriage, the curtains drawn, the pretense of life maintained through reports that he was resting or indisposed. Summer heat accelerated decomposition. The smell became impossible to conceal. Zhao Gao ordered carts of salted fish to travel alongside the imperial carriage, their odor masking the stench of decay. For weeks, the court that had governed an empire maintained the fiction that its ruler still lived, conducting business in his name, issuing orders under his seal, preserving the appearance of continuity while the reality rotted in a curtained vehicle. The procession reached Xianyang, and only then was the death announced. Hu Hai assumed the throne as second emperor, Zhao Gao assumed effective control of policy, and Li Si discovered that the partnership he had entered would benefit only his co-conspirator. The succession had been managed, but the management had required deception, murder, and the elevation of the least capable candidate to the most demanding position in the world. The emperor who had unified China was buried in the mausoleum he had spent decades preparing. The rivers of mercury flowed beneath the artificial stars. The crossbows waited in the darkness. The terracotta army stood at attention in their pits, guarding a master who would never inspect them, defending an empire that was already beginning to collapse. The craftsmen who had built the tomb and the concubines who had served in the palace joined him in death, sealed beneath the earth with the secrets they had kept. Qin Shi Huang had sought immortality through elixirs that did not work and journeys that found nothing. He had built a tomb designed to preserve his power forever, had created an army of clay soldiers to serve him eternally, had ordered sacrifices that demonstrated his authority extended beyond the boundary that limited ordinary men. But he had not prepared a succession that could survive his death, had not raised sons capable of holding what he had built, had not created institutions that functioned independently of his personal will. The empire that had terrified China now belonged to a boy manipulated by a eunuch, its greatest general dead by his own hand, its most capable administrator compromised by conspiracy. The system that had conquered 6 kingdoms and unified a civilization contained no mechanism for correcting the errors that incompetent successors would inevitably make. The first emperor was dead. The dynasty he founded would not long survive him. The second emperor proved exactly as catastrophic as his elevation had promised. Hu Hai possessed neither his father's intelligence nor his father's capacity for sustained effort. He preferred pleasure to governance, delegating authority to Zhao Gao, while he enjoyed the luxuries that absolute power provided. The construction projects continued, the Epang Palace, the roads, the walls, consuming resources and conscripts at rates that a stronger ruler might have moderated. The laws remained as harsh as ever, their punishments falling on populations that had endured decades of sacrifice and saw no prospect of relief. Zhao Gao accumulated power with each passing month, eliminating rivals, promoting dependence, and isolating the young emperor from anyone who might offer honest counsel. Li Si, who had served Qin for decades, found himself outmaneuvered by the eunuch he had conspired with. Accused of treason on fabricated evidence, the architect of unification was subjected to the punishments he had helped design, beaten, tortured, and finally cut in two at the waist in the marketplace of Xianyang. His family was exterminated to the 3rd generation. The system he had built devoured him with the same efficiency it had devoured so many others. The empire's collapse began with a work crew that missed a deadline. In 209 BC, a group of conscripts traveling to garrison duty on the northern frontier was delayed by heavy rains. Under Qin law, arriving late for military service was punishable by death, the same penalty as rebellion. 2 of the conscripts, Chen Sheng and Wu Guang, recognized that they had nothing to lose. If they continued to their posting, they would be executed for tardiness. If they rebelled, they might at least die fighting. They chose rebellion. The uprising spread with a speed that revealed how fragile imperial control had become. Chen Sheng and Wu Guang killed their escort officers, rallied their fellow conscripts, and declared the restoration of the kingdom of Chu. Across the empire, populations that had been suppressed rather than reconciled saw an opportunity to settle old grievances. Former aristocrats emerged from hiding. Local officials defected to movements that promised relief from Qin's severity. Within months, The empire that had seemed unshakable was burning from multiple points of ignition. Chen Sheng's rebellion was eventually crushed, and Chen Sheng himself was killed by his own driver. But the fire he had started could not be extinguished. New leaders emerged to continue the resistance. Xiang Yu, a nobleman from Chu, whose grandfather had been a famous general, possessed military abilities that made him the most dangerous commander the rebels could field. Liu Bang, a minor official of peasant origins, proved more politically astute than his aristocratic rival, building coalitions that Xiang Yu's arrogance repelled. The two men would eventually destroy the Qin together, then turn on each other for the right to replace it. Zhao Gao's control over the second emperor became so complete that he could test it openly. In a court assembly, he presented a deer and declared it to be a horse. Ministers who agreed that the deer was indeed a horse demonstrated their loyalty to Zhao Gao. Those who insisted it was a deer revealed themselves as potential opponents. The incident, pointing at a deer and calling it a horse, became a Chinese idiom for the deliberate distortion of truth by those in power. The court that had governed an empire had been reduced to a theatre of absurdity, its ministers competing to affirm lies rather than risk the consequences of honesty. The absurdity could not survive contact with military reality. As rebel armies approached the capital, Zhao Gao recognized that the second emperor had become a liability. He forced Hu Hai to commit suicide in 207 BC, installing a nephew named Ziying as a replacement, but Ziying proved less pliable than expected. Within days of his elevation, he lured Zhao Gao to a meeting and killed him, exterminating his family with the same thoroughness the Qin had applied to so many others. The eunuch who had manipulated an empire ended as another victim of the violence he had helped perpetuate. Ziying's reign lasted 46 days. Liu Bang's forces reached Xianyang first, accepting the surrender of a ruler who had no army left to resist. Liu Bang treated the city and its inhabitants with restraint, hoping to win legitimacy by demonstrating that he would govern more humanely than the dynasty he was replacing. But Xiang Yu arrived shortly afterward, and Xiang Yu's was not interested in restraint. The Qin palaces burned for 3 months. Xiang Yu's soldiers looted everything portable and destroyed what they could not carry. The complex that Qin Shi Huang had built to glorify his dynasty, the replicas of conquered kingdoms' palaces, the administrative buildings, the monuments that proclaimed eternal rule, was reduced to ash and rubble. The library that had survived the book burnings was destroyed in the conflagration, along with records that might have preserved details of the reign that later historians could only reconstruct from fragments and second-hand accounts. Ziying was executed. The Qin dynasty that was supposed to last 10,000 generations had survived its founder by barely 4 years. The empire Qin Shi Huang had unified would fracture again into civil war between Xiang Yu and Liu Bang, a conflict that ended only in 202 BC when Liu Bang emerged victorious and established the Han dynasty. The new emperor took a title, Gao Zhu, that acknowledged continuity with the imperial system Qin had created while promising a different approach to the exercise of imperial power. The Han would rule China for over 4 centuries, and every dynasty that followed would face the same fundamental question: how to maintain the unity that Qin Shi Huang had achieved while avoiding the harshness that had destroyed his successors. The answers varied across 2 millennia of Chinese history, but the framework within which the questions were posed remained essentially what the first emperor had established: centralized bureaucratic administration, standardized laws and measurements, a single ruler claiming authority over all Chinese civilization. These concepts, revolutionary when Qin Shi Huang implemented them, became the permanent assumptions of Chinese governance. Later dynasties condemned the Qin while adopting its methods. Confucian scholars, whose intellectual ancestors had been buried alive and whose texts had been burned, wrote the histories that shaped how subsequent generations understood the first emperor. They portrayed him as a tyrant whose cruelty had brought deserved destruction, whose legalist policies had violated the moral principles that proper governance required, whose obsession with control had produced the chaos he sought to prevent. The condemnation was sincere, but the same scholars served emperors who exercised power through institutions that Qin Shi Huang had created. The tomb remained sealed beneath its artificial mountain, its mercury rivers flowing in darkness, its crossbow traps armed against intruders who never came. Dynasties rose and fell above it. Armies marched across the land that concealed it. Farmers cultivated fields within sight of the burial mound without understanding what lay beneath. The terracotta army stood in their pits, their painted surfaces fading, their weapons rusting, their vigil uninterrupted by the centuries that passed. In 1974, peasants digging a well in Shanxi province struck something unexpected. Fragments of terracotta, then a head, then an entire figure of a soldier that had been buried for over 2,000 years. The discovery initiated excavations that continue to the present day, revealing the scale of a project that ancient sources had described, but that no one had quite believed. The 8,000 soldiers, the bronze chariots, the underground palace whose contents remain largely unexplored. The tomb of Qin Shi Huang proved as ambitious as the man who commissioned it. The sealed central chamber has never been opened. Chinese authorities have declined to excavate, citing concerns about preservation and the technological limitations that make proper conservation uncertain. The mercury that ancient texts described may still flow beneath the artificial stars. The crossbows may still be armed. The body of the first emperor may still rest where it was placed 22 centuries ago, surrounded by the treasures and the traps and the sacrificed servants who were meant to serve him forever. He had been born a hostage's son in an enemy city, had survived assassination attempts and palace coups, had conquered 6 kingdoms and unified a civilization, had built walls and roads and palaces and tombs, had burned books and buried scholars and sought immortality through every means that desperation could suggest. He had created an empire and a system of government that would endure for 2,000 years. He had also created a reign so harsh that it collapsed within years of his death, so brutal that his name became synonymous with tyranny, so dependent on his personal will that no successor could sustain it. The judgment of history has never reached consensus. He was a monster who killed millions, a visionary who created a nation, a tyrant who destroyed, a builder who unified. He was all of these simultaneously, his legacy too vast and too contradictory for simple verdicts. The China that exists today, its sense of itself as a single civilization, its assumption that unity is the natural order and division an aberration, its governmental traditions of centralized bureaucratic control, bears his imprint in ways that no subsequent dynasty entirely erased. The silent soldiers still stand in their pits near Xi'an, tourists filing past them daily, cameras capturing images that would have meant nothing to the craftsman who shaped each individual face. The burial mound still rises over the plains, its secrets preserved by the same determination to control that characterized everything the first emperor did. The mercury may still flow, the traps may still wait. The man who unified China and terrorized it into obedience may still lie in the darkness he prepared, guarding an empire that outlasted his dynasty by millennia. He sought immortality through elixirs and expeditions, through searches for islands that did not exist and magicians who could not deliver what they promised. He achieved it instead through stone and clay, and the ideas he imposed on a civilization that could never entirely escape them. The first emperor is dead. He has been dead for 22 centuries. But the soldiers still stand guard, and the empire he imagined, unified, centralized, governed by laws rather than customs, still shapes the lives of over 1 billion people who have never heard his arguments but live within the framework he created. Beneath the earth near Xi'an, in darkness that has never been broken since the tomb was sealed, the rivers of Mercury flow past artificial mountains toward artificial seas. The stars made of pearls shine over a chamber that no living person has seen since the craftsmen who built it were buried with their knowledge. The crossbows wait for intruders who will never come, or who have not come yet. The first emperor keeps his vigil. The soldiers keep theirs. Some empires are never entirely over.